The CIA was established during the presidency of Harry S. Truman on the 26th of July, 1947. And since then, it's conducted some very interesting projects. But there are some operations that have raised eyebrows over the years, and some of those cases seem almost too outlandish to believe. Number 10. The subject of UFOs, or UAPs as they're often known in modern times, is a very conscientious one, since it divides opinion among those with an interest in unidentified anomalous phenomena, or, in layman's terms, the possibility of the existence of extraterrestrial beings. For centuries, people have reported seeing strange lights in the sky and having encounters with strange beings that they're unable to explain. But it isn't just the public that's shown an interest in the subject. Governments around the world have conducted studies and investigations into these sightings, and the US government is no different. One such study was conducted by the CIA in 1952, after it became apparent that the UFO phenomenon was not going away anytime soon, and people wanted answers. The summer of that year saw an unprecedented number of reports of strange sightings in the sky, some of which occurred near National Airport in Washington. The government believed these particular sightings were the result of temperature inversions in the area, but many people felt that this explanation was lacking. Hence, the CIA decided to establish a panel called the Robertson Panel, which was led by physicist H.P. Robertson, along with other scientists that included a rocket engineer and an astronomer. They were tasked with interviewing military personnel who'd reported seeing strange objects in the sky, as well as the head of Project Blue Book, the US Air Force's official project in which they investigated reports of such objects by members of the public. It should be noted, though, that the government wasn't solely interested in finding out whether we were being visited by extraterrestrial beings. They were far more concerned over the possibility that these craft that were spotted originated in the Soviet Union, and that the US was unknowingly under surveillance. Keep in mind that if these objects were in fact Soviet, and they were used to attack the US, there was a very real possibility that they would be spotted in the sky, and the resulting panic could cause members of the public to clog up phone lines that were needed for national defense. In short, the panel's main goal was to debunk the claims of extraterrestrial craft in the sky, rather than finding out what they were. But their task made it all the more difficult when experts could find no explanation for many of the photos that they were asked to study. For example, the Tremonton and Great Falls films left photo analysts baffled, since they showed aircraft that could not possibly exist, and yet they were recorded on video for all to see. One officer who had filmed a strange object over the skies of Utah remained adamant that he had seen a solid, piloted craft, and there was no explanation other than the suggestion that it came from somewhere in space. Those in attendance were asked to at least consider the fact that these photos and films showed nothing but seagulls, atmospheric phenomena, or reflections from normal aircraft, but many refused to relent. Many people who'd been interviewed by the panel disagreed with their findings. Nevertheless, their objections fell on deaf ears, and when all was said and done, it was decided that public opinion on the matter needed to be manipulated, and that any groups involved in the reporting of UFOs should be closely monitored by the government. Number 9. Since the agency was established, the CIA has gained a reputation for being involved in some very questionable activities and programs, one of which was given the name Operation Midnight Climax. During the early part of the 1950s, the CIA started showing a marked interest in the possibility of mind control. They felt that it could be used as a weapon against their enemies, and if proven possible, they could give them the upper hand in virtually any situation. The problem was that not many people would willingly offer themselves up to be experimented on, especially when those experiments could potentially harm their minds. Hence, the CIA set up a covert operation that would make guinea pigs out of unsuspecting members of the public. They had already established the well-known program called MKUltra, which experimented with the use of electroshock therapy, radiation exposure, and hypnosis, among others, but they'd seen very little success. Shortly after the program was put into place, Sidney Gottlieb, the director of MKUltra, helped the CIA acquire a large amount of illegal substances from a pharmacy in Switzerland, and it was soon put to use in an effort to find out what effect the substance would have on unsuspecting subjects that had been placed in an intimate environment. They rented an apartment on Chestnut Street in San Francisco, and it was turned into an upscale-looking brothel. It was also fitted with several listening devices, tape recorders, and a two-way mirror through which the agents could watch their subjects, make notes, and film what happened. Street workers were employed and asked to bring their clients to this room, each receiving $100 per client. Once the men were in the room, they were given an alcoholic beverage that had been laced with an illegal substance, and they were then closely monitored. The street workers would ask certain questions at different times in the encounter in an effort to ascertain when the clients became most susceptible to mind control. Strangely, many of these men never realized that they were under the influence of a substance, and they had differing responses. It would soon become apparent that the substance was most effective once the encounter was over, but especially if they were asked to stay for a while longer rather than leaving right away. They started discussing their jobs, businesses, and with careful coaxing, even their families. But it soon became clear that the entire operation was nothing more than a farce. Those who were tasked with gathering data from behind the two-way mirror would drink cocktails and other alcoholic beverages while conducting the studies, and in some instances would even make use of the street workers' services. Others suggested that they be allowed to ingest the illegal substance, and soon it seemed as though they were attending a party rather than gathering data. It remains unknown how many men were experimented on, since Gottlieb attempted to destroy all the files connected to Operation Midnight Climax and MKUltra. Number 8. The Watergate scandal is part of U.S. history that is still discussed today. It started on the 17th of June 1972, when 5 burglars were arrested while they were breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex in Washington, 4 of whom had served in the CIA in the past. The White House immediately claimed that the Nixon administration had no hand in the crime, but it would later come to light that the president had indeed been involved in criminal activity, thanks to the Nixon tapes, secret recordings of phone calls that Nixon made and received in the Oval Office. During the ensuing investigation, Nixon resigned, and the director of the CIA, James Schlesinger, ordered CIA employees to report any unlawful acts that had been carried out by the agency and that may have breached the CIA's charter. These reports were collected and published in a document that became known as the Family Jewels. Once the document was complete, it was handed over to President Gerald Ford, who expressed his horror at some of the activities that had been carried out by the CIA. He discovered that they had secretly monitored members of the public who stood against the war in Vietnam, and that they'd opened the mail of members of the public. It also came to light that they'd been experimenting with mind control, and that this had been done in the worst possible way. Unsuspecting subjects had been fed illegal substances, after which they were monitored by CIA agents. It was a clear violation of the public's trust in the government, which had gone unmonitored for almost 2 decades. Then there were the hundreds, if not thousands, of assassination attempts on the life of Fidel Castro, the then president of Cuba, using poisoned cigars, a contaminated scuba suit, exploding seashells, and a poisoned pen, to name but a few. There had also been attempts against Patrice Lumumba, the former prime minister of the Republic of the Congo, Rafael Trujillo, the former president of the Dominican Republic, and the former president of Chile, Salvador Allende. From the very moment that the report was handed to President Ford, the then Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, suggested that it be kept classified, since he believed it could do an enormous amount of damage to the country, even more than the Watergate scandal had caused. Ford agreed, but in time, certain parts of the report were leaked to the public, and agents were forced to admit their involvement in some of these heinous operations, many of which used the public as guinea pigs for strange and unethical experiments that in the end had no merit whatsoever. The eventual director of the CIA, William Colby, admitted to his involvement in the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro and others, but assured the government that these attempts had been halted. it came to light that Robert Kennedy had a hand in these assassination attempts, and when the public found out about these activities, they were appalled. They became disillusioned with the US's intelligence departments, and the government responded. The supervision of intelligence departments was restructured on both an executive and legislative level, and major changes were made in the way that these covert operations were carried out. Number 7. Most of us find it hard to believe that there are people in the world with what's described as psychic abilities that allow them to see information that would otherwise be unattainable. This is likely because most people who claim to have these abilities are nothing but charlatans. Nevertheless, the US government showed a much focused interest on such abilities during the 1960s and 70s, and the CIA in particular conducted several experiments to ascertain whether these abilities could prove useful to the government and the military. There's no doubt that employing someone who could see into the future would be of enormous benefit, but they also considered the possibility of remote viewing, whereby a psychic could see what was happening in faraway areas, such as foreign countries, or in the case of one psychic, Juan, even distant planets. The agency's interest in remote viewing and other psychic abilities is said to have started during the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were doing their utmost to outsmart each other technologically and psychologically. Whichever side was able to harness psychic abilities first would undoubtedly gain the upper hand in the war, and hence they started experimenting with different theories, such as predicting the future and exteriorization, which is similar to astral travel, during which a person's consciousness is said to leave their bodies, allowing them to travel vast distances while their bodies remain in the same spot. Swan claimed to have perfected this ability, and he apparently demonstrated this at the Stanford Research Institute, which soon piqued the interest of the CIA. Swan suggested that he could perform what he called controlled remote viewing, during which he could perform exteriorization, but with a very specific target in mind. Many people were skeptical about his claims, since he was affiliated with the Church of Scientology, and so when he arrived at the Stanford Research Institute, the first test that he performed was for telekinesis. The results were confusing, but impressive. They were eventually published, and the CIA decided to conduct further experiments with Swan. He was very confident in his abilities, and in 1973 suggested something that at first seemed ridiculous to the CIA, since he proposed a remote viewing session of the planet Jupiter and its moons. He convinced parapsychologist Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff to go ahead with the idea, and when Swan started his session, he asked for half an hour of silence. He then started reporting what he could see. He described the planet's atmosphere and the structure of its core, and next he described strange crystals in its atmosphere, which he likened to rings around Saturn. He added that these crystals glitter and that they may be banded together. While he believed the rings around Jupiter to be similar to Saturn's, he added that they were not as far from the planet as Saturn's, and he expressed his belief that the crystals might reflect radio probes. He then traveled to the planet's surface, which he described as being covered in sand dunes, like a desert on Earth. These dunes were also made up of crystals, but much bigger than the ones in the rings, and hence they slid down the dunes. He also experienced unbelievable prevailing winds and saw a massive mountain range in the distance. These descriptions went on for just about 20 minutes, and years later, in 1979, the existence of these crystals in the rings of Jupiter was confirmed by the Voyager probe. Number 6. During the 1870s, Uri Geller, an Israeli-British illusionist and magician, rose to fame after he made several appearances on television, and many people became convinced that he had psychic abilities that seemed to defy belief. He's since stated that his gift is by no means a special one, since he believes we all have psychic abilities, but fail to recognize and train them properly. During his appearances, he would seemingly bend spoons using nothing but his mind, successfully perform remote viewing, and appear to read people's minds. He's even suggested that some of his abilities were given to him by extraterrestrial beings. These claims may seem ridiculous to most of us, but the CIA certainly took an interest in Geller, as is evidenced by a document that was declassified in 2017. He, like Ingo Swann, worked with Dr. Russell Targ and Dr. Harold Puthoff at the Stanford Research Institute in 1973, after the two doctors were tasked with confirming whether Geller's abilities were real, since he claimed that they were of a paranormal nature. Speaking about the experience, he stated that he was left in a shielded room and asked to perform several psychic exercises, one of which involved the duplication of images that he could not see. According to Geller, he was remarkably accurate and successfully demonstrated his abilities. He then traveled to the UK, where he performed several more tests under the supervision of MI5 and MI6, among others. He claims that during one test, he managed to make an object disappear in one room and reappear in another. Following this, he was once again tested by the CIA and asked to manipulate the trigger of a nuclear weapon with his mind. He says that as soon as he started his effort, several of the scientists in the room started to hallucinate, something that even he couldn't explain. Later on, he was asked by NASA astronaut Edgar Mitchell to meet with Wernher von Braun, a German rocket scientist who, after the Second World War, became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center of NASA. Despite von Braun's past, Geller eventually agreed, and he was shown two strange pieces of metal, which Geller immediately knew were not from our planet, and later on, he was shown the remains of several extraterrestrial beings. He since stated that he knows beyond a doubt that extraterrestrials have visited our planet and believes they may be living among us already. He's also certain that the remains he saw that day will one day be revealed to the public, and that our perception of the universe will change dramatically once this is done. Number 5. Thanks to documents that were made public in September of 1998, we know that the CIA did its best to prevent Salvador Allende, the former president of Chile, from becoming that country's ruler. The project in question was named Fubelt, though it's sometimes referred to as Project Track 2. The pages in this declassified document reveal that the project started when then-director of the CIA, Richard Helms, was asked by President Richard Nixon to organize a coup in Chile. A meeting was called during which the details of the coup were discussed, and the members of a special task force that would carry out the plan were identified. The task force would perform its duties under the supervision of Thomas Karamessinis, who at the time was serving as the CIA's deputy director for plans. Karamessinis was told that he needed to establish the details of the coup within 48 hours, and that these plans had to be sent to the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. Once this was done, Karamessinis, Kissinger, and Alexander Haig held a meeting on the 15th of October 1970, during which they decided that pressure had to be kept on Allende, and that his weaknesses should be identified. Karamessinis then sent a message to Henry Heckscher, the CIA station chief in San Diego, in which he confirmed the orders that Allende had to be overthrown at all costs, and that the coup had to be given the green light to go ahead. One of the first steps in the operation was to supply Allende's opposition in Chile's elections with support, and the CIA donated about $500,000 to different candidates. Added to this was a propaganda campaign, in which Allende was portrayed as being in cahoots with communist elements. But possibly after finding out about the plan, Cuba hit back and donated $350,000 to Allende's campaign. The result was that Allende continued to lead the election race, but he failed to achieve the necessary 50% majority vote, and it was up to Chile's Congress to elect the new president. The actual coup was scheduled to take place before this decision was made, since Chile's Congress usually picked the candidate with the most votes, which in this instance was Allende. Right-wing Chilean military officers were identified, and those who agreed to take part in the coup were recruited. The first plan was to abduct the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, René Schneider, but the first two attempts failed. During the third attempt, the operation descended into chaos when Schneider was fired upon and his life was ended. This proved to be a major setback, as voters started showing more support for Allende than ever before. The decision was then made to bribe members of the Chilean Congress with $350,000, and in exchange, they were asked to vote against Allende's presidency being made official. This proved to be yet another failure, as Congress voted in favor of Allende, and he was inaugurated on the 3rd of November of that year. Next, Nixon ordered Helms to, as he put it, make the Chilean economy scream, and the resulting plan became known as Project Fubelt. Several US-owned industries in Chile were nationalized, and the relationship between Chile and the US started to deteriorate as inflation started to skyrocket and demand started to outweigh supply. Nixon then placed a loan blockage on Chile, and international banks were asked not to supply that country with funds, further worsening Chile's economic climate. The US told the Chilean government that if they wanted funds, they could turn to the Soviet Union for aid, but the Soviet Union had no interest in supporting Allende. Ultimately, the coup proved to be a success when, on the 11th of September, 1973, the elected government was overthrown, and Allende's life came to an end. Number 4. Shortly after the outbreak of the Cold War, the CIA started Operation Red Sox, which sought to slow or completely stop the economic and political expansion of the Soviet Union, following the end of the Second World War. It was one of the very first covert operations carried out by the US during the Cold War. It involved sending planes that were piloted by Czech and Hungarian pilots, and which were filled with CIA agents, to Ukraine, where the operation would take full effect. But getting there was no easy task. The planes had to be flown towards Turkey, after which they traveled above the Black Sea to evade radar systems. Once this was done, they headed to Lviv, where the agents would parachute to the ground. Once they made it safely onto Ukrainian soil, they would meet up with members of the resistance, who would supply them with information that was then fed back to their CIA handlers. This was done using state-of-the-art technology, such as new radios and other communications equipment, in an effort to provide the US government with unprecedented insight into the activities that were being performed in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. Initially, the operation saw a modicum of success, as national movements started to form in Belarus, Poland, the Baltics, and of course Ukraine. For 6 years, agents were flown into the country to collect information, but soon enough, the plan started to fail. All in all, 85 agents were flown in, all of whom made it onto the ground without any issues. But before long, the Soviet government cottoned onto the plan, and up to 85% of the agents that landed were either captured or executed. Some of the agents were first interrogated and assaulted in an effort to extract information about the US's activities, but strangely, the agents' handlers took a long time to figure out that this was happening. Despite many agents going missing, there were more sent on this doomed mission, and with every flight that made it to Ukraine, more lost their lives or were captured. It's believed that the handlers were duped by misinformation that was spread by the Soviet government, or that they simply refused to believe that their agents had been caught. It would later come to light that faux resistance groups had also been established in Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. These groups were being controlled by the KGB, and agents who sought to stoke the fires of the resistance were nothing more than sitting ducks. Today, Operation Red Sox is still considered to be one of the CIA's greatest failures that cost many agents their lives and exposed the CIA's gullibility to the rest of the world. Number 3. Operation 40 began on December 11, 1959, with a memo from Colonel J.C. King to CIA Director Alan W. Dulles, urging action against Cuba's left-wing dictatorship to prevent similar unrest in other Latin American countries. Originally planned for 40 agents, the task force grew to 70 and was led by Tracy Barnes. Funding came from oil magnates George Bush Sr. and Jack Crichton, who were already involved in right-wing activities. Bush reportedly recruited Cuban exiles for the CIA, while Crichton helped plan an invasion. The operation soon included former members of the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities in Cuba and some CIA agents, forming an assassination squad. Their goal was to eliminate problematic Cuban military and political figures and identify US traitors. One early mission involved saboteurs from Operation 40 planting explosives on a weapons ship headed for Havana Bay. The resulting explosion, triggered by pressure switches after unloading, eliminated 75 people and injured over 200. Operation 40 members also worked with Brigade 2506, a CIA-sponsored Cuban exile group invading Cuban towns to capture and assassinate remaining Castro supporters. But the operation was compromised at the Bay of Pigs. After being attacked and arrested, one member died and the rest were interrogated. Although trained not to talk, Brigade 2506 intelligence officer Jose Gonzalez revealed the operation's existence, ending this phase. In the following years, Operation 40 shifted to counterintelligence, spying on Cuban exiles and their US contacts to find Cuban spies, though none were ever identified. By 1970, only a few members remained, and the operation fully ended in 1972. Number 2. In 1962, U.S. anxiety over Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba led the CIA to propose Operation Northwoods. Castro had nationalized U.S. companies with Soviet ties, causing unease in the U.S. military. The Department of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba to generate support for an invasion. Since no legitimate reason existed, the plan involved manufacturing pretexts. Suggestions included sinking a U.S. ship at Guantanamo Bay, or fabricating an attack on the naval base, then blaming Cuba to sway public opinion toward invasion. Operation Northwoods was part of the larger Operation Mongoose, which also included the document Possible Actions to Provoke, Harass, or Disrupt Cuba, recommending false flag operations. CIA Director Alan Dulles also enlisted mafia figures, including Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, in attempts to damage Castro's reputation and assassinate him. Ideas included spraying a chemical at a television station to induce hallucinations, or contaminating his shoes with thallium to cause hair loss. A plan to use Cuban official Rolando Cubella for the assassination was abandoned when he refused a polygraph test. Other appalling Northwoods suggestions included U.S. military attacks on U.S. citizens and sinking boats of Cuban refugees, with the blame to be placed on Cuba. The operation was abruptly terminated by President John F. Kennedy, who was enraged by the proposals. Declassified documents made public in 2001 confirmed that none of the suggestions were ever implemented. Number 1. Like so many CIA operations, Project Mockingbird started at the very beginning of the Cold War. But unlike many others, it was firmly aimed at the US itself and the manipulation of the media. Many people believe that the operation is still active today, but this has not been proven. According to journalist Carl Bernstein, Operation Mockingbird's origins date back to World War II, and back then the CIA had not been created yet, and its predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, was in place. It had already formed close relationships with members of the press during the war. When the war came to an end, many officials from this office joined the newly established CIA, and the members of the relationships that had been established between these agents and the media continued to flourish. Just 2 years after the war had ended, the Cold War started, and the US government decided that it needed to control the narrative that was being presented by the media, not only in the US but also abroad. While some journalists were already on board with the plan, many more were recruited by the CIA. They were told to steer certain news stories in a desired direction, and in some cases to fabricate news articles that would paint the US in a favorable light. But these journalists also served another purpose. While researching their stories, they kept their eyes and ears open for any information that could prove useful to the US government, and this information was then sent back to the CIA. Furthermore, any news that could prove harmful to the US's reputation was to be suppressed, either never being reported or altered in favor of the government and its military. This was to be done in the US and in foreign countries. In some cases, stories were pre-written by members of the CIA, after which they were published in well-known newspapers. Agents also contacted editors and media executives who were tasked with steering the narrative of their respective outlets in a certain direction that was outlined by the agency. When aspiring journalists were identified, they were approached by the CIA and told that they'd be given exclusive rights to certain stories and would be afforded access to certain pieces of information that were then to be published. These activities extended into Latin America, Europe, and several other countries in order to discredit the Soviet Union and to create the illusion that the US had the upper hand in the Cold War. It remains unknown just how many journalists were involved in Operation Mockingbird, but it's believed they numbered in the hundreds. It's still considered to be one of the best examples of media manipulation in history, and hence the operation was seen by many as unethical. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.